now receives that information and integrates it, takes it to the auditory association cortex, which processes it more. Sasa elewa, sasa tuko na information about the auditory. Si alisikia hiyo sauti when he was watching the pornographic videos, then ameangalia ikaprocessiwa na auditory na occipital lobe. Sasa amesikia imeprocessiwa na what we call the temporal lobe. Here visual association occipital lobe, where we have the primary visual cortex. Here the temporal lobe, where we have what? Where we have the primary auditory cortex and the visual auditory cortex. After visual auditory cortex receives the information about the voice, and the visual association cortex receives the information about the visual information, now the two areas now takes the information to another region we call the amygdala. Now within the brain we have a system called the limbic system. The limbic system is what controls emotions, whether sexual, whether eating habits, whether emotions, whether hunger. You understand? So once the amygdala is a part of the limbic system. The limbic system has different nuclei, and amygdala is one of them. So once amygdala receives this, amygdala also plays a role in what we call olfaction. Olfaction ni kunusia. So it also plays the emotional part of kunukia kitu. Amygdala controls that, and amygdala also controls anger, by the way. Kukasirika sio ile ya kusikia njaa. You understand? So what will happen is that after receiving that information, the amygdala takes that information to a region we call the amygdala. Sasa ikishapiki hiyo information, sasa inapeleka kwa hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what we call, the hypothalamus is a limbic system nuclei. Now after the amygdala the hypothalamus after hypothalamus picks that information, now it will take it to a region we call the ventral tegmental area. Within the ventral tegmental area is where we have dopaminergic producing cells, and any cell which produces chemical within the brain is called a neuron. A neuron is basically the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. So within the ventral tegmental area is where we have the dopaminergic producing neurons. So the dopaminergic producing neurons produce a chemical we call dopamine. Sasa dopamine ni ile chemical sasa huwa inafanyanga mtu asikie furaha. Unaona hata ukikunywa pombe, kutumia zile madrugs, kutumia kishash, sasa ndio inafanyanga usikie vizuri, usikie ni kama akili iko relax. Sasa ile time uko happy, ile time hata ufanye kazi, ile time unataka kujienjoy, dopamine inakuanga juu. So the ventral tegmental area ndio iko na hizo cells zenye zina produce nini? Dopamine. So dopaminergic producing neurons will produce dopamine, and dopamine now is a very big hormone when it is in high concentration, kwa sababu inafanyanga usikie vizuri hata unajisahau ka uko na maisha. You understand? And what will happen, dopamine, medical students know that dopamine has receptors on two regions, that is the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus of accumbens, or the accumbens nucleus. Now the prefrontal cortex is found within the frontal lobe, inaitangwa frontal lobe of the brain. That is where we have the dopaminergic producing neurons, not producing neurons, the dopaminergic receptors. Now the prefrontal cortex is a very very important region kwa sababu number one, the prefrontal cortex ndio huwa ina control the higher intellectual functions. Unaona zile functions za kufikiria, making wise decisions, reading and understanding concepts, learning skills, working memory. That is the function of the making judgments, making decisions, very critical decisions. That is the prefrontal cortex. That is, prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe go up. And what will happen is that once that chemical targets that place, you become now advanced. Now it starts sasa inakufanya ukue comfortable, unapata uwezi fikiria, unapata uwezi soma, uwezi fanya a skill. You can learn a skill like Adobe Photoshop, you can learn a skill like you can learn how to treat patients like me, you can learn how to how to do some tasks like coding. Sawa, you can learn how to how to communicate with people. So basically sasa dopamine kisha target hapo, sasa mambo yako kwisha hapo, na hapo sasa ndio unaanzanga kuona maisha yako inaanzanga kuenda hivi, kwa sababu the prefrontal cortex is the chief region yenye wewe na control the decisions that we make in life. So that is what happens when dopamine targets the prefrontal cortex. It also targets a region we call the nucleus of accumbens, ama the accumbens nucleus. Accumbens nucleus is a nucleus found within the deep of the cerebral cortex. So what will happen is that ikitarget hiyo region, sasa hiyo ndio region sasa inafanyanga sasa mtu akuwe na addiction. Unaona sasa that act yenye sasa unasikia ni kama una masturbate, unanyonga siku ya kwanza, ya pili unataka kuacha, unanyonga mara 5, unaona hiyo siku ya 3 unanyonga mara 10, alafu sasa inakuwa ni kama habit. So the nucleus of accumbens is what actually triggers the addiction. You understand? So hiyo addiction sasa ikishapata, inamaanishanga the nucleus of accumbens, ama the accumbens nucleus is really working, because that is the addiction center, and it's also the center that watu wenye wanakunywa cocaine, watu wenye wanatumia drugs ndio inakuanga active. You understand? So that is basically the process under which masturbation, what really happens when a person gets addicted to masturbation. That is the neurophysiological process that happens. 1, the visual is picked by the eye communicates with the visual association cortex, the vision is picked by the ear communicates with the auditory association cortex, or within the temporal lobe. Now the auditory association cortex and the visual association cortex communicates with the what? The amygdala. The amygdala communicates with the what? The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus communicates with the what? The ventral tegmental area. Within the ventral tegmental area tumesema tunatengeneza nini? Dopamine. Dopamine inatengenezangwa na nini? Dopaminergic producing neurons, which now form dopamine. Dopamine is the hormone which is responsible for relaxation. Kama unasikia una relax, unasikia utamu, sasa hiyo ndio inakuanga, hata ndio inakuanga very high when mtu akifika orgasm, when you are interacting with a woman, or when a woman is interacting with a man during sexual orgasm. Dopamine inakuanga juu, ndio ina increase what we call sexual polarity. Sijui kama mnanielewa hapo guys. Sawa. Sasa dopamine iko na receptors kwa prefrontal cortex na nucleus of accumbens. The prefrontal cortex ndio ina control major functions. That is higher intellectual function, thinking, learning skills, judgment, making decisions, working memory. A nucleus of accumbens ndio iko responsible for addiction. So when a person is addicted to masturbation, the nucleus of accumbens is very active and is usually activated by this chemical we call dopamine.